Widowed at 61, Ingrid Kowalczyk had always believed that a marriage, once built brick by brick over 3 decades, couldn't hide anything from her. She had seen every version of her husband there was to see. Exhausted, triumphant, sick with the flu, giddy after a good verdict. So when she found the second set of keys in his coat pocket 3 weeks after the funeral, small, brass, unfamiliar, she assumed they belonged to some forgotten storage unit or an old filing cabinet. She had no idea they would unlock a house on a bluff 200 miles away, a house where another woman had been signing his name to a lease for 11 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ingrid met Casimir Wrenfield in 1991 when she was 26 and working the front desk at a maritime insurance firm in Corrimal Heights. He was 41 then, a claims attorney with a corner office and a laugh that carried down the hallway. People said Cas Wrenfield could talk a shipping company out of a lawsuit before lunch and still make time to ask the receptionist how her mother's surgery went. Ingrid had liked that about him immediately, the way he noticed small things. He noticed her hands were always cold. He noticed she skipped lunch on Thursdays to save money. 6 months after he started bringing her coffee at her desk, he asked her to dinner. A year after that, he proposed in the parking lot of the very building where they'd met. No ring yet, just a question, because he said he couldn't wait until he found the right one. His children were not so easily won over. Odalise was 17, already sharp-tongued and watchful. Tobias was 15, quiet in a way that felt less like shyness and more like calculation. Sable was only 11, and for a while she liked Ingrid, brought her drawings, asked to be walked to school. That changed the year she turned 14 and started repeating things her mother's side of the family said at holidays. Comments about gold diggers and second wives and women who married up. By the time Ingrid and Cas married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse, none of his 3 children attended. Odalise sent a card. It said congratulations and nothing else. Ingrid tried anyway. The way people do when they've decided love is worth the effort even when it isn't returned in kind. She learned Tobias's football schedule and never missed a game, even the away ones, even when Cas couldn't make it because of work. She remembered Sable's birthday every year with a gift that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with actually paying attention. A set of paints one year, a leather journal the next. She hosted Thanksgiving in a house that never quite felt like hers, cooking dishes Cas's late wife used to make, dishes she'd learned from his mother because nobody else would teach her. For 31 years, she did this. She built a life around a family that mostly tolerated her, and she told herself tolerance was a kind of foothold, something she could work with over time. Cas, for his part, was good to her in the ways that were visible. He remembered anniversaries. He held her hand in public, even at his own firm's Christmas parties, even when Odalise stood 3 feet away with her jaw tight. He told her she was the calm center of his life, the only room in the house where he could exhale. But there was always a door that stayed shut. He traveled for depositions and conferences, sometimes 10 days at a stretch, and he called every night at exactly 9, a habit so consistent that Ingrid stopped questioning where the calls originated. He kept an office in the house that he locked, always, even when he stepped out to get the mail. When she'd asked about it once in the early years, he'd smiled the way he did when he was closing conversation rather than opening one. That's just paperwork, Ingrid. Boring stuff. You'd fall asleep reading it. He handled their joint finances himself, paid the mortgage, paid for her car, gave her a monthly allowance for groceries and clothes that felt generous at the time, and only later, much later, felt like something closer to management. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every month or so, sometimes more, Cas would drive north for what he called fishing trips. He'd load a cooler and a tackle box in his truck on a Friday morning and come home Sunday night smelling like salt water and pine smoke, tired in a way that seemed earned. Ingrid never went with him. He said the cabin he used, borrowed from an old law school friend, was barely big enough for one person, let alone 2, and besides, he knew she hated the smell of fish guts on ice. She'd laughed and let it go. 31 years of letting it go had trained her not to notice the shape of what she wasn't being told. She would think back on those fishing trips constantly in the months after his death, turning them over like stones, looking for the cracks she should have seen. At the time, they were just Sundays. Just Cass coming through the door a little sunburned, kissing her forehead, asking what was for dinner. She had no reason then to wonder what county that cabin was actually in, or whose name was on the deed, or why a man who claimed to hate paperwork kept an office locked tighter than a bank vault. She had 31 years of proof that he loved her, or so she believed, and proof, she would learn, is only as good as the evidence you're allowed to see. The years accumulated the way years do when you're not paying close attention to them. One Thanksgiving folding into the next, one winter into the next, until Ingrid looked up one day and realized she'd been Mrs. Wrenfield longer than she'd been anyone else. She turned 30, then 40, then 50, and somewhere in that stretch the stepchildren grew up and had children of their own, which should have softened things. It didn't, not really. Odalise married a hedge fund manager named Greer and moved into a house in Corrimal Heights, nearly identical to the one she'd grown up in, as if she'd measured her father's life and simply built a copy. Tobias took over a construction firm his mother's brother had started, and Sable, after 2 divorces before the age of 30, moved back into the guest house behind Cass's property and never quite left again. Ingrid learned to read a room the way people learn a second language, fluently, but never natively. She knew when Odalise was about to make a comment disguised as a compliment. She knew when Tobias wanted something because he'd bring up his father's health first, softening the ground. She knew Sable's moods rose and fell with whatever man had most recently disappointed her, and that Ingrid herself would absorb some of that anger simply for being present and convenient. None of them ever hit her or screamed at her or did anything a court would recognize as cruelty. They simply made sure, in 100 small ways, that she understood her place in the family tree. A graft, not a root. Cass noticed some of it. He'd catch Odalise mid-sentence and say her name in a warning tone, and Odalise would stop, roll her eyes, change the subject. He told Ingrid once, late at night, that he was sorry his children couldn't see what he saw in her. "I built 2 lives," he said, "and I'm terrible at making them fit in the same room." She'd laughed at the time, thought it was just a husband's clumsy apology. She didn't ask him what he meant by 2 lives. There was no reason to. People said things like that all the time, meaning nothing more than work and home, obligation and love. The fishing trips continued without interruption, through her 40s and into her 50s, through 2 of Cass's hip surgeries and 1 bout of pneumonia that kept him out of work for a month. Even sick, even limping, he found a way north every few weeks. She started to notice, without letting herself fully notice, that he was gentler with her in the days after he came back. More attentive. He'd bring her small gifts, a scarf, a jar of local honey, things he said he'd picked up at a roadside stand. Once he brought back a piece of sea glass, green and worn smooth, and told her it reminded him of her eyes. She kept it in a dish on her dresser for years, never once wondering who might have shown him where to find it. His locked office stayed locked. The finances stayed his to manage. When she turned 55 and asked, mostly out of curiosity, whether they should update their will, he told her he'd already handled it years ago, that everything was in order, that she had nothing to worry about. He said in the tone he used for closing arguments, final and unbothered, and she believed him because believing him had never once cost her anything she could point to. There were moments, small ones, that she would only understand in hindsight. A phone call he took in another room and came back from looking pale, waving off her question with something about a difficult client. A birthday, his 68th, when he disappeared for an entire Saturday and came home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, which she attributed without much thought to some department store sample he must have brushed against. A checkbook she glimpsed once in his truck, registered to an account she didn't recognize, which he explained away as a firm expense account before she could finish asking. She wasn't a fool. She wants that understood later when she tells this part of the story to anyone who asks how she missed it. She wasn't naive and she wasn't blind. She had simply built her entire adult identity around trusting one man completely. And trust Once it becomes the architecture of your life, it is very hard to take apart board by board. It's easier to explain away a strange smell or a strange checkbook than to imagine the man who held your hand at his own grandchildren's christenings was living 2 full lives on a schedule you helped make possible. Packing his cooler, kissing your forehead, driving north with a lightness in his step that you mistook for 3 decades, as the simple joy of fresh air and quiet water. By the time Cas turned 82, Ingrid had stopped counting the fishing trips. They were simply part of the calendar, like his Tuesday racquetball or his Sunday crossword. She had a life of her own by then, too, a garden she was proud of, a book club, 2 friends from the neighborhood she trusted more than she trusted most of the Wrenfields. She thought, if she thought about it all, that she and Cas had settled into the kind of comfortable late marriage where both people know exactly what they're getting and have made peace with it. She had no idea how much of her comfort had been built on a foundation she'd never been allowed to see the underside of, and no idea how soon she would be forced to look. Cas died on a Thursday in October, 3 days after returning from what he'd called his last fishing trip of the season. He'd complained of tightness in his chest that morning, waved off Ingrid's suggestion to call the doctor, said it was probably just the cold catching up with an old man's lungs. He was gone by noon, collapsed in the hallway outside his locked office, a set of keys still in his hand. The paramedics said it was fast, a blockage, sudden and total. They told her, gently, that there was nothing she could have done, and she believed them, because there was some mercy in that particular kind of helplessness. She sat with him in the hospital hallway for almost an hour before anyone came to take him away, holding a hand that was already cooling, trying to reconcile the stillness of his face with the man who had kissed her forehead 11 hours earlier. She kept waiting to cry properly, the way she imagined a wife of 31 years should cry, and instead she felt something quieter and stranger settle into her chest. Not grief exactly. Not yet. Something closer to the sensation of a house going silent after a party ends, the echo of noise that isn't there anymore. The funeral was held 6 days later at the largest church in Corrimal Heights, the kind with stone pillars and stained glass windows that threw colored light across 400 folding chairs, every one of them filled. Cas had spent 5 decades building his firm into the most respected maritime law practice in the state, and it seemed like every judge, partner, and former client he'd ever shaken hand with came to pay respects. Deacon Osric Thane, who had known Cas for 20 years through the church's finance committee, gave a eulogy about integrity and steady hands. A senior partner from the firm spoke about Cas's brilliance in the courtroom, his gift for making impossible cases sound simple. Tobias spoke about his father teaching him to sail. Odalise spoke about family loyalty, her voice cracking at exactly the right moment, though Ingrid noticed her eyes stayed dry the entire time. Nobody mentioned the man who brought Ingrid coffee every morning for 3 decades. Nobody mentioned 31 Thanksgivings, or the nights she stayed up with him when his hip surgery went wrong, or the small rituals that had made up the actual daily texture of their marriage. He was eulogized as a father, a colleague, a pillar of the legal community. He was not eulogized as her husband, not really, not in any way that suggested the eulogist understood what that word had meant to either of them. She was seated in the 3rd row. Odalise had arranged the seating chart herself, and when Ingrid arrived that morning, a folded card with her name sat 2 rows back from where Odalise, Tobias, and Sable were seated with their spouses and children, a tight cluster of Wrenfields facing the altar as a unit. We wanted the immediate family up front, Odalise had explained the day before, not quite meeting Ingrid's eyes. You understand. Ingrid had understood, in the sense that she recognized the sentence for what it was, a decision already made and dressed up as courtesy. She sat in the 3rd row in a black dress she'd bought that week, because none of her existing clothes had felt right, and she watched the backs of 3 heads that had never once, in 31 years, turned around to include her in anything that mattered. At the reception afterward, held in the fellowship hall behind the church, Ingrid stood near a table of catered sandwiches she had no appetite for and listened to a cluster of Sable's friends discuss the service in low voices that weren't quite low enough. Poor Sable, one of them said. Losing her father like that. At least she still has her brother and sister, real family, to get through something like this. Real family. Ingrid had heard that phrase before, in different words, across 3 decades of holidays and hospital waiting rooms, and it had never stopped landing the same way, a small, precise blade sliding between 2 ribs. She left the reception early before the crowd thinned, and drove home alone to a house that felt enormous and wrong in its silence. She stood in the hallway outside Cas's office for a long time that night, staring at the locked door, running her fingers along the frame the way she'd done 100 times before without ever once trying the handle. She didn't try it that night either. It felt, even then, even with him gone, like a line she wasn't allowed to cross, a habit of respect so deeply worn into her that grief hadn't yet loosened its grip. It was 2 days later, going through his coat pockets to decide what to donate and what to keep, that she found the second set of keys. Small, brass, unmarked except for a tag with a single word scratched into it in Cas's handwriting. Home. Not office. Not cabin. Home. She turned the tag over in her palm for a long time, sitting on the edge of their bed, trying to understand why a man would label a set of keys with a word that already belonged, as far as she knew, to the house she was sitting in. She told herself it was probably nothing, an old label from years ago, a joke she'd forgotten the context for. She put the keys in the drawer of her nightstand and tried to sleep, and she would think back on that moment many times in the weeks that followed. The last night, she still believed she understood the shape of her own marriage. The will reading was scheduled for the following week at Anwar Finkel's office downtown, the same firm that had handled Cas's affairs for nearly 15 years. Ingrid dressed carefully that morning, the same black dress from the funeral, her hair pinned the way Cas had always liked it. She told herself there was nothing to be nervous about. 31 years of marriage, of showing up, of building a life around a man who had told her more than once that she was the only calm room in his house. Surely that counted for something on paper, the way it had always seemed to count for something in practice. Odalise, Tobias, and Sable arrived together, 10 minutes early, dressed like people attending a business meeting rather than the reading of their father's final wishes. They took the 3 chairs on one side of the conference table without discussion, an arrangement so automatic it must have been decided in the car. Ingrid sat across from them, alone, in a chair that suddenly felt too large. Anwar Finkel began with the standard language, testamentary capacity, sound mind, proper witnesses, and then moved into the numbers. Cas Wrenfield's estate was valued at just over $7 million. The house in Corrimal Heights, worth close to $1.5 million. Investment accounts, retirement holdings, a life insurance policy that alone totaled 6 figures. Ingrid felt her shoulders drop half an inch, the first real relief she'd allowed herself since the funeral. Whatever else was true, whatever strange keys sat in her nightstand drawer, surely a man who loved her for 31 years had made sure she'd be taken care of. The house, Anwar continued, his voice slowing in the particular way lawyers slow down before delivering bad news, is left in full to Cas's 3 children, to be divided equally or sold and split 3 ways at their discretion. The investment accounts, the retirement holdings, the life insurance, all divided the same way, equally among Odalise, Tobias, and Sable. Ingrid felt the relief drain back out of her chest as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by something colder. And then Anwar reached the paragraph concerning Ingrid herself, and his hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady as he held the document. "I have to read this as written," he said quietly. "I want you to know I raised concerns about the language when this was drafted." Cas insisted. He cleared his throat and began. "To my wife, Ingrid, who has been a steady and comfortable presence in my household for these many years, I leave the property located at 4 Harrow Point Road, along with its contents, and I ask that she vacate the family home within 30 days of my passing, as that residence is intended for my children and their families." Comfortable presence. The word sat in the room like something spilled. Not wife of 31 years. Not partner. A comfortable presence, as though she were a piece of furniture that had served its function and could now be relocated. Ingrid felt her face go hot, felt the old training rise up in her the instinct to stay composed, to not make a scene, an instinct 3 decades deep and impossible to override even now. Across the table, Sable was already looking at her phone. Tobias exhaled slowly through his nose, the closest thing to satisfaction his face ever showed. Odalise folded her hands and looked at Ingrid with an expression that might have been sympathy on someone else's face, but on hers looked closer to relief that the matter had resolved itself so cleanly. "Where is Harrow Point Road?" Ingrid heard herself ask, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Anwar hesitated. "It's on the coast," he said. "About 200 miles north. I don't have extensive details on the property itself. Only that your husband acquired it many years ago and maintained it separately from the rest of his holdings. He set it up that way deliberately. I want to be honest with you, Ingrid, I don't fully understand his reasoning, but I trust he had one." Odalise spoke up before Ingrid could respond, her tone gentle in the way that costs nothing. "Dad mentioned that place once or twice over the years. Some old fishing property, I think. Probably needs a lot of work after all this time." She offered something close to a smile. "At least it's something, Ingrid. A roof over your head." A roof over her head. After 31 years of Thanksgivings and hospital rooms and holding a hand that had never once, until 3 days ago, gone cold. Tobias stood, already moving into logistics, discussing timelines for listing the Corrimal Heights house, mentioning a realtor he'd already spoken to before the will had even been formally read. "The market's strong right now," he said, to no one in particular. "We'd like to move quickly." Anwar slid a plain envelope across the table before she could absorb the rest of what was happening. "This came with instructions to give it to you privately," he said. "There's a deed inside, already transferred to your name, and a letter your husband asked me to include exactly as written." Ingrid opened it with hands that weren't quite steady and found a single sheet of Cas's stationery, his familiar slanted handwriting filling the page. "Ingrid," it began, "go to Harrow Point as soon as you can manage it. Bring the brass key, the one marked home, you'll need it. I know what the will says, and I know how it will sound sitting in that office. I wrote it that way for reasons I couldn't explain while I was alive, and I'm asking you, one last time, to trust me the way you always have. Everything will make sense once you arrive. I am so sorry it has to happen this way." She read it twice before folding it back into the envelope, aware of 3 sets of eyes watching her from across the table, aware that whatever waited 200 miles north on a stretch of coastline she'd never once visited in 31 years of marriage was about to rewrite everything she thought she understood about the man she'd buried the week before. The 30 days that followed unfolded with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, as though Odalise, Tobias, and Sable had been quietly planning this transition long before their father's heart gave out in the hallway outside his office. Contractors arrived within the first week, walking through rooms with clipboards while Ingrid was still living in them. A kitchen designer spent an entire Tuesday afternoon discussing which walls could come down, standing in the exact spot where Ingrid made coffee every morning, gesturing through her as though she were a drape someone had forgotten to take down. Nobody asked her to leave her room. They simply behaved as though she already had. She overheard most of it because they made no effort to keep their voices low. Sable, walking through the garden with a landscaper, remarked that the rose beds would need to be torn out, said something about wanting a modern look, clean lines, nothing fussy. Those rose beds had taken Ingrid 11 years to establish. She'd planted the first bushes the same spring she and Cas moved into the house. Small gestures of a woman trying to make a place feel like hers when very little else about it did. Sable didn't know that, and wouldn't have cared if she had. Tobias handled the financial side with the same brisk detachment he brought to his construction projects. He arranged for a realtor to photograph the house on day 12, moving Ingrid's belongings out of frame without asking, stacking her reading glasses and half-finished crossword puzzles into a box on the kitchen counter so the counter would look, in his words, more neutral for buyers. She found the box that evening and stood holding it for a long time in the empty kitchen, not sure whether to be angry or simply tired. The nights were worse than the days. Ingrid lay awake in the guest room, the one they'd suggested she move into since the master bedroom needed to be staged, and ran calculations in the dark. 61 years old. No job in decades. A resume that ended in 1991 with a receptionist position at an insurance firm that had merged and dissolved twice since then. The Harrow Point property was, according to Odalise, some falling-down fishing shack on the coast, likely worth little more than the land it sat on. She imagined selling it for whatever she could get. Imagined stretching that money across a decade. She wasn't sure her body would even survive. Imagine the particular indignity of applying for assistance at an age when most people were simply enjoying their grandchildren. On other nights, the fear curdled into something closer to fury. She would lie there replaying the will reading, the phrase comfortable presence looping through her mind until it lost all meaning and became just sound, just syllables, and she would ask the ceiling how a man who held her hand at every family funeral, every hospital bed, every quiet Sunday morning for 3 decades could have written those words and meant for a lawyer to read them aloud to his own children. She never landed on an answer. Anger, she was learning, burns fast and leaves you colder than before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On the 22nd day, Ingrid stood at the sink rinsing a coffee cup when she heard Odalise and Sable talking in the dining room, their voices carrying through the doorway the way voices do in a house with hardwood floors and high ceilings. A house built for entertaining, not for privacy. "I still can't believe he left her anything at all," Sable was saying. "That fishing property's probably worth, what, 60,000? 70 if the land's decent." "Guilt," Odalise said. He knew exactly what he was doing, giving her just enough that nobody could say he left her with nothing, without actually touching what belongs to us. She should be grateful, honestly. A woman her age with no real work history, no family of her own, she could easily have ended up with nothing at all. They laughed, not cruelly exactly, just the easy laugh of people who had never once had to wonder where they'd sleep. Ingrid gripped the edge of the sink until her knuckles went pale and said nothing, because 31 years of training does not undo itself in 3 weeks. Even when every instinct in her body wanted to walk into that dining room and ask them what, precisely, they thought 31 years of showing up for their family had been worth. She packed slowly over the final week, sorting a life into what would fit in a car. Most of her clothes went into donation bags, because she realized, folding them, that she'd chosen almost every piece to please a man who was no longer there to notice. She kept 2 boxes of things that were entirely hers, photographs from before the marriage, letters from her mother, a chipped ceramic dish her grandmother had given her as a wedding gift decades ago that had somehow survived every renovation and every redecoration Cass's taste had demanded over the years. She kept the piece of sea glass from her dresser, the one Cas had said reminded him of her eyes, though now she turned it over in her palm and wondered, with a hollowness she hadn't expected, whether he'd found it on one of his fishing trips or whether someone else had handed it to him. On the morning of the 30th day, Tobias arrived early to supervise the movers, standing in the driveway with his arms crossed while men in matching shirts carried out furniture that had never technically belonged to her. Ingrid loaded her car in silence. 2 boxes, 3 suitcases, a photograph of her wedding day that Odalise had tried to claim belonged to the estate until Ingrid, in the only sharp moment she allowed herself that entire month, told her she could fight a 61-year-old widow in court over a single framed photograph if that was really how she wanted to spend her father's memory. Nobody said goodbye. She pulled out of the driveway of the only house she'd called home in 31 years with the brass key, marked home, sitting in the cup holder beside her, and she pointed the car north, toward a stretch of coastline she had never seen, carrying a letter that promised everything would make sense once she arrived, and no longer entirely sure she believed it. The drive took just under 4 hours, the last 40 minutes along a narrow coast road that climbed and dipped past weathered gray houses and stretches of sea grass bent sideways by wind. Ingrid had expected, based on Odalise's offhand description, something closer to a shack, boarded windows, a collapsing porch, a building she'd have to talk herself into even entering. What her GPS eventually delivered her to was nothing like that at all. Harrow Point Road ended at a modest gravel turnaround, and there, perched on a bluff above a curve of rocky shoreline, stood a converted signal station, white clapboard with black trim, a small attached keeper's house, and a stone walkway that had clearly been tended, not neglected. The grass around it was cut. The windows were clean. Smoke, faint and recent, seemed to have curled from the chimney within the last day or two, though the house looked empty now. Ingrid sat in the car for several minutes before she found the will to get out, and before she'd even shut the driver's door. A woman was walking toward her from a small cottage further down the road, moving with the brisk purpose of someone who'd been watching for a car to arrive. "You're Ingrid," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Ingrid answered, though she still had no idea how a stranger on an unfamiliar road would know her name. "How did you know that?" "I'm Yolanda Pruitt," the woman said, extending a hand roughened by decades of work. "I run the supply shop in town. Cas told us you'd come, eventually," said a watch for a woman driving a gray sedan. "Said you'd probably arrive looking like you hadn't slept properly in a month." She studied Ingrid's face with something like sympathy. "Looks like he wasn't wrong." Ingrid felt something tighten in her chest. "He told you about me. My name. What I look like." Yolanda's expression shifted. Careful now. The look of someone realizing she's about to hand over something heavy. "He told us a great deal, dear. I think it's better if you go inside first. There's someone who's been waiting to explain it properly, and it isn't really my place." Someone. The word landed strangely, and before Ingrid could ask what she meant, the front door of the keeper's house opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She looked to be in her late 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back simply, wearing a cardigan the color of the sea behind her. For one disorienting moment, Ingrid thought she might be looking at a relative of Cas's she'd never met, some cousin, some old family friend. Then the woman spoke, and something in her voice, low, careful, apologetic before she'd even said a full sentence, told Ingrid this was not a stranger to Cas Wrenfield at all. "My name is Marisol Quintrell," the woman said. "I think we need to sit down. I don't know quite how to say this in a way that won't hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I've had 11 years to prepare for this conversation, and I still don't have the right words." Ingrid followed her inside on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. The interior of the keeper's house was warm, lived in, nothing like the cold, formal rooms of the house she'd just been evicted from. A fire had recently died down in the hearth. 2 mugs sat in the drying rack by the sink. Ingrid noticed them and felt something cold slide down through her stomach. Marisol sat across from her at a small kitchen table and folded her hands, the way people do when they're bracing to deliver something they've rehearsed many times in their head, but never out loud. "Cas and I were married," she said. "In this state, in a courthouse 2 towns over 11 years ago. I have the certificate if you need to see it." "I know how that sounds." "I know exactly how it sounds, and I want you to understand I didn't know about you when it happened. Not for the first 2 years. He told me his first wife had died young, that he was alone, that his children barely spoke to him, and he'd finally found someone who made the silence bearable. It wasn't until I found tax documents in his truck by accident that I learned there was a woman named Ingrid, still very much alive, still very much his wife, 200 miles south." Ingrid sat perfectly still, the way she'd learned to sit still through 31 years of small humiliations. Except this was not small. This was the floor of her entire adult life, giving way beneath her all at once. "You knew," she finally said. "For 9 years, you knew about me, and you stayed." "I did," Marisol said quietly. "Not because I thought it was right. Because by then I loved him, God help me, and because he told me leaving would destroy you both, that you'd built your whole life around him, and he was too much of a coward to choose. He said the same thing to me that he apparently told you, in different words. That he'd built 2 lives and couldn't figure out how to fit them into the same room. I believed I was the secret. It never once occurred to me, until the day your name came up in his will, that maybe I was the one he'd built the real life with, and you were the performance he kept in Corrimal Heights for everyone else to see." Ingrid put her face in her hands, and for the first time since the hospital hallway, she cried the way she'd been waiting to cry for weeks, not delicate, not composed, but loud and shaking and entirely without the training that had governed every public moment of her married life. Marisol didn't reach for her. She simply sat, letting the silence hold both of them. until Ingrid finally lifted her head and asked the only question that mattered. Why would he leave me this house? Why would he send me here to the one place that would tell me the truth about everything? Marisol reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out a thick cream envelope, Ingrid's name written across the front in Cas's unmistakable slanted hand. Because I think, she said gently, he finally ran out of ways to be a coward about it, and this was the only kind of honest he had left in him. Ingrid held the envelope for a long moment before breaking the seal, aware of Marisol watching her with an expression that held no triumph in it, only exhaustion, the particular tiredness of someone who has waited years to stop carrying a secret alone. Inside were 4 pages, Cas's handwriting slanting more than usual in places, as though his hand had been unsteady when he wrote it. My dearest Ingrid, it began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found your way to Harrow Point, and Marisol has likely already told you what I never had the courage to say myself. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I don't think that's mine to ask for. I only want you to understand what happened, as much as I understand it myself. The letter went on for pages, and Ingrid read every word twice, the way she had read the will, searching for the scene where the story finally made sense. Cas wrote that he had met Marisol 11 years earlier, at a legal conference on maritime salvage rights, and that what began as friendship had become something he never intended and never knew how to stop. He wrote that by the time he understood what he'd built, walking away from either woman felt like an amputation he wasn't brave enough to perform. He wrote that Ingrid had given him 31 years of steadiness he didn't deserve, and that Marisol had given him a version of himself he'd forgotten existed, and that he had spent a decade being furious at his own cowardice without ever once finding the spine to fix it. I built this house for Marisol, he wrote, but I want you to have it now because it is the only property in my name that was never touched by my children's expectations, never performed for anyone, never part of the life I put on for the world. Marisol has agreed to this. She has her own means, her own life, and she does not want or need what I've left you here. What I am truly leaving you, Ingrid, is the truth and the legal documentation to protect yourself with it, should Odalise, Tobias, or Sable ever try to take even this from you. Attached to the letter, in a second sealed folder, was the marriage certificate from Cas's courthouse ceremony with Marisol, along with a sworn statement Cas had filed with Anwar Fenkel 2 years earlier, acknowledging that his marriage to Marisol, entered into while still legally married to Ingrid, constituted bigamy under state law, and that any attempt by his children to challenge Ingrid's inheritance on the grounds of marital impropriety would open the entire estate, all $7 million of it, to being contested and potentially reallocated by the courts, given that a second, undisclosed marriage complicated every asset transfer he had made in the past decade. He had, in his own careful and belated way, built her a weapon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It took 11 days for Odalise to arrive at Harrow Point, driving up the coast road in a car far too polished for the gravel turnaround, Tobias and Sable following in a second vehicle behind her. Ingrid had known they would come eventually, once someone at the firm let slip what kind of property their father had actually left behind, once curiosity or greed or both got the better of them. She met them on the porch rather than inviting them in, Marisol's suggestion, delivered the week before with the calm authority of someone who had learned, over 11 years with Cas, exactly how his children operated. This is quite the fishing shack, Tobias said, looking up at the signal station's clean white trim, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. Odalise got straight to it. We think there's been a serious oversight in how the estate was divided, she said. This property is clearly worth far more than anyone accounted for, and given that it was acquired during your marriage to our father, we believe it should be considered part of the marital estate, subject to division among all of us. Ingrid let the silence stretch a moment before she spoke, the way Cas used to before delivering a closing argument, a habit she hadn't realized she'd absorbed until this exact moment. You're welcome to pursue that, she said. But before you spend money on lawyers, I think you should know what this property actually is and why your father really gave it to me. She told them, not gently, Not cruelly either, simply factually, the way Marisol had told her, laying out the second marriage, the sworn statement, the years of overlap between two households that had run parallel without either woman's full knowledge. She watched Sable's face go white. She watched Tobias sit down hard on the porch railing. She watched Odalise, always the sharpest of the three, understand immediately what this meant for the entire estate. Not just for Harrow Point, but for the house in Corrimal Heights, the investment accounts, every dollar their father had left them. If any of you challenge this will in court, Ingrid said, the entire estate becomes contestable because your father was legally married to two women at once for 9 years. I have the documentation. Your father made sure of that because in the end, whatever else he was, he wanted me protected from exactly this conversation. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The wind off the water filled the silence instead, and Ingrid watched three grown adults who had spent 31 years making her feel small finally understand that the smallest person in this story had just become the only one holding all the cards. They left without agreeing to anything, which Ingrid had expected. Odalise wanted time to consult her own attorney, though the tightness in her voice suggested she already understood what any attorney worth hiring would tell her. Tobias didn't speak again before getting into the car. Sable, oddly, was the one who lingered longest on the porch, looking at Ingrid with an expression that wasn't quite apology, but wasn't hostility either, something closer to the first honest look she'd ever given her in 20 years. I didn't know any of this, Sable said quietly. About the second marriage. About any of it. I know, Ingrid said. Your father was very good at making sure nobody knew more than he wanted them to. Sable nodded, and for a moment looked like she might say something else, then didn't, and got into the car with her siblings, and Ingrid watched the two vehicles disappear down the gravel road toward the coast highway, back toward Corrimal Heights and the mansion and the life that had never quite made room for her. The legal challenge never materialized. Anwar Finkel called 2 weeks later to confirm that Odalise's attorney had reviewed the sworn statement and advised against any court action, since reopening the estate risked unraveling every asset transfer Cas had made in the last decade, exposing all three siblings to years of litigation over an estate that could, in theory, be redistributed entirely differently if a judge found the second marriage material to the original will. They withdrew quietly, the way people do when they've realized the fight costs more than the prize. Ingrid spent her first months at Harrow Point learning the rhythms of a town she'd never known existed. Despite it sitting only 200 miles from the house she'd called home for 3 decades. Yolanda stopped by twice a week with fresh bread and news of the harbor. Deacon Osric Thane, who ran the small church 2 streets from the water, invited her to Sunday services, and she found herself going, not out of obligation, but because the congregation greeted her by name within the first month, something that had never quite happened in 31 years of attending church in Corrimal Heights. Marisol, surprisingly, became something Ingrid hadn't expected at all. Not a friend exactly, not at first, but a woman she could sit across from without pretense, both of them having loved and been failed by the same man in different rooms of the same lie. They met for coffee most weeks that winter, careful conversations that slowly stopped being careful, until one afternoon Marisol laughed at something Ingrid said and caught herself, surprised by her own laughter, and Ingrid realized she was glad, genuinely glad, that Cas had at least given both of them each other in the wreckage of everything else he'd taken. By spring, Ingrid had turned the keeper's house into something entirely her own. She kept the fireplace, kept the view of the water that had clearly meant something to Cas, but replaced the furniture piece by piece with things she chose herself for the first time in longer than she could remember. She opened the second envelope she found tucked in Cas's desk drawer that March, a smaller bequest he'd apparently added just months before his death, a modest trust fund earmarked for whatever Ingrid chooses to build next. In his handwriting, at the bottom of the page, "You spent 31 years building a life around me. Build something around yourself now. I'm sorry it took me this long to make that possible." She used part of it to open a small counseling practice above Yolanda's shop. Not licensed therapy, nothing so formal, but a quiet space 2 afternoons a week where women who'd been left behind by death, by divorce, by husbands who'd built lives they never saw the underside of, could come and simply be heard by someone who understood exactly what that particular silence felt like. She called it the second key, and within a year, it had become something like the town's unofficial living room, women arriving with coffee and leaving, most days, a little lighter than they came. On the anniversary of Cas's death, Ingrid stood on the bluff behind the signal station, watching the tide pulled back from the rocks below, and found she felt something closer to peace than grief. He had been a coward in the ways that mattered most, and she would carry that truth for the rest of her life without pretending otherwise. But he had also, in his last and only truly honest act, handed her the exact tools she needed to walk away from everyone who had ever made her feel small and to build at 61 a life that finally, entirely belonged to her. She was still learning who that woman was. She suspected she would be learning for years. But for the first time since she could remember, she wasn't in a hurry to find out. The water kept moving below her, patient and indifferent to all of it, and Ingrid Kowalczyk stood on her own bluff in her own house, finally, fully awake to a life she hadn't known was waiting for her. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.